All right, well, welcome. I just want to welcome everybody out to the May Meetup for Data for Good Saskatchewan. This is a really exciting meetup, something we're really proud. We've been wanting to do this for quite a while. Data for Good Saskatchewan, newly Data for Good Saskatchewan, formerly Data for Good Regina. We do a number of projects. We do a lot of work with a lot of different nonprofits throughout the city of Regina, throughout Saskatoon and around the province. And we have been doing so many of these cool projects that we thought this would be a really good time to bring a couple of the folks in from our different nonprofit partners that we work with and give you a chance to see some of the good work that happens on Data for Good projects. Have a chance to celebrate the work that's been done, talk about the impact of how our data dashboarding and the different analytics that our teams are doing and building out for these nonprofit partners, how that's going to really drive impact. So today we have a really exciting agenda today with Kerrie Issac from Sexual Assault Services of Saskatchewan. Joining her will be Asia Mason from the Yukon Services, Yukon Status of Women office. So she's a real influencer in the space, and so she's going to talk a little bit more about the impact of data and analytics on sexual assault services and providing those services. And then we'll hear from our friends at the Regina Public Library about some work that we did for them as well. There are other projects we've had on the go, so this is by no means the only projects that have been done over the last little while, but these are some ones that we've been particularly excited about the results, and fortunately we've been able to get some good speakers from. So just to start us off, I mean, I noticed that we always are getting more and more people involved every single day. I think our LinkedIn page grew from like 0 people a couple of months ago, or very small numbers, to over 200 now. So thank you everybody who's been following us on LinkedIn and all of that stuff. Quick overview of the agenda. We are going to start off here. Listen to me talk about how good Data for Good is and all the stuff we've got going on. We're going to move into Sexual Assault Services Saskatchewan and the work that we've done for them, building out their data center, not data center, but a data center on their website, and then talk about the Regina Public Library and the work that we've been doing for them as well. Down at the bottom here, we just have our list of, I'll update you on some of the changes we've had on the leadership team in a short little bit here. So just who we are, I first want to announce, and this is exciting, I think we've kind of been slowly inching towards this, but now we have officially rebranded our Meetup page, and we have now aligned it with the LinkedIn page, and very soon we'll be updating our on the website as well. But we are now officially Data for Good Saskatchewan. I actually, Scott, this is new information to you, but I literally just ran it by National yesterday, and Joy gave the seal of approval. So for all of our longtime members, for those folks who are just joining us, we're now very proud to represent the entire province of Saskatchewan as Data for Good Saskatchewan. So if you're in Regina, you're in Saskatoon, you're in PA, heck, even if you're in Rollo, you're part of you can be part of Data for Good Saskatchewan. You've got representation. So this is a big change for us. It's an exciting one. But yeah, who we are a chapter of a larger organization called Data for Good, data and AI enthusiasts. We focus on building community of data professionals and building a practice of data around the province and helping nonprofits in the province with data challenges that they're facing, because they often don't have the resources to build out data teams and do this sort of thing for themselves. So our members generously volunteer their time to produce awesome reporting and data products and other really cool things. So just a few updates for everybody, for our members. So like I said, Data for Good Regina, we are now the official Data for Good Saskatchewan. What that means is that for the Meetup page that we all signed up on, the Data for Good Saskatchewan one is the official one. We have about 200 members who are on the Data for Good Saskatoon page. We will be ending support for that page on July 30th. So July 30th, that's going to be the point at which we make that cutoff and we say, all right, enough is enough. We're going to be cutting off support for that. It does cost us a little bit to maintain those Meetup pages, so we figure that's a kind of a way to streamline operations. Also wanted to announce that we kind of have we've kind of been working to expand out the leadership team of Data for Good Saskatchewan. So we've tried to get a few more folks involved. to kind of help give us a bit more capacity. So just wanted to announce that Jasmeet Singh as our new marketing lead. Not sure if Jasmeet's there, but if you want to give him a reaction, can you do applauses in Zoom? Maybe give him a reaction, thumbs up, something like that. Welcome, Jasmeet. He's going to be helping out with the marketing. I've been kind of lifting all that myself for the last little bit, so its help is definitely appreciated. And then we also have Ross Gadzella joining us as our Saskatoon community lead. We're making a big push over the next year to really expand our operations in Saskatoon, and so Ross will be instrumental in being a lot of the boots on the ground work for that. Just at the bottom, I just put the faces of all of our current leadership team. We are also looking at structure and looking at how we can get more folks involved. So as always, if there's ways you want to help out or the ways that you want to volunteer, please reach out to us, or go to the website, Data for Good Regina for now, put your name in, sign up as a volunteer, or reach out to myself or another one of the leadership team if you want to have a more in-depth conversation on this stuff. Just to go over the leadership team really quickly here, there is Josh West. He's really looked after kind of a long time lead, and he looks after the website. We've got Chuck Plant, who's our chapter lead up in he's our lead up in Saskatoon, as well as Scott Wells and myself, who are the chapter co-leads for Data for Good Saskatchewan, and Ross Gadzella, newly joining the team, and Jasmeet as well. So just wanted to get some of that stuff out of the way. Any questions just on the Data for Good front before we get into this thing and welcome our guests? Okay. All righty. Okay, now I'm very excited to start things off by introducing our guests here. We have with us a couple of really cool guests from Sexual Assault Services Saskatchewan. And so to set this all up, in, let's say, earlier this year, our group, Sexual Assault Services Saskatchewan, reached out to us and said, hey, we have a whole bunch of data around different police reports and different organizations who are reporting incidences of sexual violence. Can we leverage that data to make something interactive, something we can give back to the community, a dashboard of sorts that we can put up on our website and we can make available to everybody throughout the province so that we can see where those hotspots for sexual violence are, and we can assess the different services of organizations like the police services and different other organizations for where those sexual assault instances are being reported, and then look at a whole bunch of other different metrics to optimize the services for those vulnerable peoples. So we had a fair bit of data that we could work with, and working with Kerrie, and her organization and her team, we took a look at that data and we put together something really neat for them. And so Kerrie Issac from Sexual Assault Services Saskatchewan and Aja Mason from the Yukon Status of Women will be talking to us today about data and the impact of analytics, and specifically some of the impact that this sort of reporting has had on sexual assault services and providing those services to survivors of that sort of sexual violence. I'm just going to read off a couple bios for both Aja and Kerrie, just so that we can kind of set this up. So to start it off with, let's meet Kerrie Issac. She is and Kerrie, I'll invite you to come on the camera if you're there, so everybody can get a chance to see you, as well as Aja. So Kerrie Issac is a dynamic leader with a passion for empowering individuals through education, networking, and collaborative opportunities to affect social change or societal change. With over a decade of experience in child development and education, Kerrie embarked on a new journey in 2016 as the Executive Director of Sexual Assault Services Saskatchewan. In her role, Kerrie has transformed SASS into a diverse team of academics and advocates dedicated to combating sexual violence. She's spearheaded the development and delivery of education, training programs, and events, providing vital resources for survivors with complex intersectional identities. Known for her strategic thinking and planning abilities, Kerrie excels in relationship management, team leadership, facilitation, coaching, community engagement, and collaboration. Her advocacy efforts extend from the provincial to the national level, empowering community members to navigate social barriers. Under Kerrie's leadership, SASS has achieved significant milestones, including securing funding for pivotal initiatives such as the Saskatchewan Sexual Violence Action Plan and 2 groundbreaking research studies on sexual violence victimization in Saskatchewan. She's also played a key role in developing SASS-based education training programs and implementing the Violence Against Women Advocate case review and best practice model in Saskatchewan. And joining her, Asia Mason. I just have her biography open here. Just give me a second. So Asia, Asia is the executive director of the Yukon Status of Women Council. As a white settler born, raised, and benefiting from the traditional territories of the Carcross, Tagish First Nation, Kwanlin, Dune First Nation, and Ta'an Kwachan Council, Asia brings a Yukon-grown interdisciplinary perspective to her work. Using grounded research methods and intersectional lens, Asia has been coordinating research projects for over 15 years, both in academia and in the not-for-profit sector. Asia has been exploring social economic data gaps in the Yukon through multiple projects, including co-authoring a number of surveys and reports that have brought to light a lot of the issues around this, as well as being a project coordinator for the YSWC's Community GBV Risk Assessment Project and the Yukon Advocate Case Review. Her diverse educational background includes a bachelor's degree in neuroscience and philosophy of science, a diploma in northern science, and she is currently completing her MA in interdisciplinary studies. She's participated in several model Arctic councils with an emphasis on using science and research as a tool for diplomacy, and is the recipient of numerous awards, including 2 ACUN awards for her northern-focused research. She has sat on the boards of Victoria Faulkner's Women's Centre, the NGO Hub Society, and is currently a commissioner for the Yukon Human Rights Committee. We also have a couple Data for Good members joining them. I'm not going to go through the full, I don't have full bios for everybody there, but Jeremy Ang is on the call. So if you want to say hi, Jeremy, who is the project lead for this project. Refine Falola, I think he's here today. Can't see. And then, so those 2. And then we had also Jeff Cow, who I'm not sure if I see in it today, but Jeremy will be walking us through the dashboard once we get to that point. Okay. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Kerrie and to Asia to tell us a little bit more about the impact that data is having on these sorts of services.
Just wait till Asia gets it up. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that intro. I think I wanted to start off with a little bit of background around who SASS is and why we decided to do this project. So Asia, next slide, please. So SASS, to understand SASS, we don't do frontline service delivery. We're more of the macro approach. So we support systems change, policy development, advocacy, like that which Brian has shared. We've done a couple groundbreaking research in the province that really were baseline for what's the gaps and what's happening. And from that research, we develop training, we co-develop training, and then we give that to our members. What else do I want to say? I sit on lots of national and provincial bodies that advocate for this issue. And that's really impactful and empowering to hear all the great work that is happening. And it's not just in Saskatchewan. Yeah, I think the next one. Just a quick map of our members. So like I said, they do the frontline services, so counseling support, and they are really the heroes that I praise all the time, the work that they do. And yeah, we just advocate for them. A lot of it is more just around funding, right? More funding, more supports. Okay, next one, Asia. So why we're here today, so like Brian had said, and I think it was even last year that we had all this data, and how do we share that with the public? A large part of what we do is that transparency with the public. and what's the issue? How is it affecting our province? What are the gaps? And particularly around case attrition, sexual violence case attrition. And from that, which wasn't surprisingly what we would find out, is that the information that is being collected from police stations and in community, all that data was very different than the numbers that were coming out in, say, Stats Canada or outer facing, like larger like institutions. So yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that. And then Asia's gonna do all the data stuff because that's what she's good at.
Thanks, Kerrie. Hi, folks. Grateful to be here, and thanks for the introduction. And sorry, Ryan, to put you on the spot about all these pronunciations. So I'm zooming in north of Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory on Quechin Council's traditional territories. And as per the intro, we're an NGO, not-for-profit that does a lot of backline work as well. So we've been digging deep into things like data, not just for good, but data for advocacy, and also advocacy about good data. So those are really important distinctions. I'm going to dive right in to save us a bit of time. If you can get on board with how my brain works very visually, and this is meant to be a description of how data doesn't necessarily reflect the occurrences of what's happening on the ground or in the real world. If you can imagine that each one of these dots is an occurrence of sexualized violence, and if you can envision that the yellow dots are the dots representing sexualized violence that will never, ever be reported in a formal context, what that translates into is that the yellow dots of sexualized violence occurrences essentially will never be captured within these broader data funnels or data nets, if you will. So when we're thinking about these data funnels or these data nets, we've got two fairly distinct types of data. We've got data that is derived through things like surveys, like the general social survey that StatsCan does and sometimes doesn't do in the territories. And I just want to emphasize as well here that there's something to keep front of mind. I'm talking about this within the context of a very rural, remote, and northern space. This also applies to Saskatchewan for obvious reasons, but I also just want to make sure that folks in the audience take away that we're dealing with not just one issue, because we could talk about like constraints on any kind of human built or social, socioeconomic indicators. Those are more or less good as a function of the types of methodologies that are implemented. But when we're talking about things like sexualized violence or gender-based violence, one of the unending issues that we come up against as researchers is that folks, they don't report sexualized violence. The vast majority of occurrences of sexualized violence do not get reported. Where we say this very generously when we say that maybe 10% of occurrences actually end up getting captured in one of these sort of streams of data. So I want you to keep in mind that we're very much highlighting here that administrative data, such as what we're seeing on the dashboard that we'll talk about a little bit later, are data that are collected through various detachments by RCMP or data that are collected and reported on through coroner's offices and so forth. This central piece here is really meant to describe the fact that we've got maybe 10% of occurrences that get reported. And what happens when those data end up in these institutions, whether that's Statistics Canada or so forth, or Stats Canada, they are, they undergo various kinds of scrubbing processes. And forgive me if this audience is really, really well aware of these kinds of processes, but here we're talking about things like ATIP in the Yukon, or Access to Information and Protection of Privacy. We're talking about the Privacy Act, the RCMP Act, legislative considerations, ethical considerations, i.e. those kinds of self-suppression rules that emerge out of research ethics boards. We're talking about institutional and procedural practices. So if we're talking about NGOs or not non-governmental or not-for-profit organizations, there's a high degree of variability in terms of how much capacity they have to actually collect data and render it in a standardized, high-quality way. All of this taken together leads us to a situation that's precarious when we're thinking about things like evidence-informed decision-making. We see this sort of depiction of what's meant to be the response systems meant to be calibrated towards sexualized violence, but recognizing that there is very little actual information that's making its way from the lived experience level to the policy and kind of formal structural responses. Now, I'm going to dig into some really concrete examples to hopefully anchor this in people's minds. I'm giving examples from the Yukon, but this is equally applicable to parts of Saskatchewan. And in this case, we're talking about RCMP data, which is a monolith. Therefore, this applies across the board. I'll make one caveat here. The RCMP are engaging in what they're calling a race-based data initiative, and they're piloting some of these projects around Canada in such a way that they're trying to start to collect disaggregated data, meaning in this context, we're talking specifically about data that reflects both the gender as well as the ethnicity of the complainant. So I'm going to draw your attention to this table in front of you. Notice this is data from 2017 to 2021. This is Watson Lake, which is the most southern community in the Yukon Territory. And notice also that we can't really tell much about that tiny 10% of occurrences that made it through that funnel. We don't really know very much more than the year and the community and the severity, i.e. if it's like a level 1 or 2 or 3. This is going to make some sense here in a second, especially if we remember what we're trying to advocate for and using data for good, which is in part evidence-informed decision-making. I'm showing you now a document that comes from the Yukon Territory's impact assessment process. And this is a decision document that basically codifies the terms and conditions for this massive mining project that's slated to occur beside Watson Lake, between Watson Lake and another tiny, tiny community in the Yukon Territory. So as you've seen highlighted, we've got something that's rendered into a legally binding document between the Crown, the federal government, and this particular proponent, such that supposedly the proponent is going to obtain baseline data about rates of violence, especially rates of violence as they impact Indigenous women near the project, and they will monitor the impacts of the project as they affect or have, an effects consequence on Indigenous women. I'm sure folks can easily connect these dots. What data are they going to use, given that the only data that exists for Watson Lake as it applies to the types of rigor and standards that typically are used by policy and decision makers is StatsCan data, which, as we know in the previous slide, this is directly from StatsCan, from the RCMP near Watson Lake, which we can see we have very little granularity or disaggregation available to inform these kinds of decisions. This is bad. This is not an example of evidence-informed decision-making. What we know, and again, I recognize I'm probably preaching to the choir here, this results in a myriad of consequences, namely the misrepresentation of reality, but also the misallocation or inadequate resourcing to actually address the issue, hence my little weird dot landscape thing, right? We don't have any yellow in the actual response systems. And furthermore, and I think we can all agree on this, only further perpetuates the neoliberal kinds of outcomes that we're seeing in 2024, polarization and fundamental mistrust of institutions and governments. So the Yukon Status Women Council is really pushing for a paradigm shift in this regard. What we're saying is we have enough evidence about the lack of evidence about things like gender-based violence or sexualized violence, but it can apply to any kind of social issue where we simply do not have the methodologies implemented to adequately create and build evidence. So in the Yukon, we have a saying, and I'm hoping some of the folks on this call will get a kick out of it, where big N is smaller than little n. We use that all the time up here. So remember back to your intro stats class, big N is meant to represent your population size, small n is your sample size. In the Yukon Territory, as in many rural, remote, and northern places, when the population size is insufficient to derive statistically significant sample sizes, let alone, the kinds of calculations required, we're left holding the bag a bit, where we're still trying to use very low quality data or data that is basically rendered useless by virtue of either having not enough to begin with or by virtue of all of those barriers we talked about prior, things like cell suppression rules. We're no longer able to make evidence-informed decisions, hence the requirement for a paradigm shift. I'm going to dig into another really concrete example for all you data nerds out there. In a project we just wrapped up, we interviewed 51 women identified folks in the Yukon. We surveyed close to 150. We took all those data, we did a bunch of thematic analyses, quantitative crunching, blah, blah, blah. We compare our data that we like the primary source data to the data that we were able to obtain and paid a shit ton of money to try and have disaggregated from these various sources. And sure enough, the data from StatsCan, the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, and the Yukon Bureau of Statistics, none of those data could be disaggregated by both gender as well as indigeneity in this case. So not surprisingly, not sure, depends on who you're talking to. What we end up with are situations where in our primary data, we see these chasms in terms of experience between, in this case, Indigenous versus Caucasian women, right? The access to housing, food security, all of these sort of structural features or like Maslow's hierarchy base level stuff that get invisibilized or completely erased or not available in these larger data repositories. That's a problem. What we want to emphasize as well here is that in cases where we do not have that level of quality of data to actually inform decision-making in a way that we know we're saving taxpayer dollars, we're not hemorrhaging resources, and we're transparent and accountable to the ways in which we make decisions. In the absence of being able to do that, what we're presupposing here is we need to position communities as the unit of measurement. And that's not to say that there aren't limitations in the kinds of data that we can collect at a community-based level, but I'm going to give a really concrete example again. We don't and can't use headcount-based data or individual-driven data in these contexts. We simply cannot. There are too many barriers in terms of the actual acquisition of data and the subsequent ways in which the acquired data, albeit a tiny sliver of the entire spectrum of occurrences, how those data are washed, cleaned, scrubbed, or in effect, rendered fairly useless. This is the reality that we're in. Instead, we ought to be looking at the basic things that all of the literature for the last 30 to 50 years have been telling us. That community, we can measure things like adequate access to available housing or affordable housing, access to justice, access to equitable and fair pay, and so forth. These are really, really easy metrics that we can use to actually more reliably suss out how well a community is doing, and furthermore, how well a community might not be doing. This is where proxy indicators get really fun and mixed methodologies. It's not to say that there isn't a place or a use for these kinds of quantitative data sets, but also, and forgive me for folks who might not know the math, but this is where we have to be really critical about things like sensitivity analyses, where we can be creative by using not just proxy indicators, but recognizing that for each metric that we're trying to derive to measure a social phenomenon and the subsequent impacts that spending or policy changes have on that social issue, we really need to be clear on what the inflection point is within that particular data set, which is to say, once the big N in the big N is smaller than little n, once big N gets big enough, perhaps we will be able to reach some meaningful, saturation. In the absence of having access to the sort of requisite input data, we have to be more creative. We have to think about things like principal component analyses, right? Measuring the relationship between something over here and how it relates to this thing over there. We want to implement mixed methods, community-based research, like what you folks have been doing with SASS and Kerrie's crew. At the end of the day, and I think I'm, again, preaching to the choir here, we know we're here to do advocacy with data, but in a lot of instances, people either have very little literacy as it comes to data and the fundamental gaps that exist, but also I think we put a lot of faith and a lot of perhaps unwarranted value in the data that currently exists. And this isn't without thinking about the difference between mass big data that the private sector is collecting, especially as it compares to things like public sector, like governmental data and so forth. We're just, until we do massive law reform and change things like the Privacy Act or the RCMP Act, or compel a different definition of evidence in legislation vis-a-vis, should we not make space for and room for how it is that data gaps influence and affect decision-making? All of that is taken together to say, we're here to try to promote good, equity, equality, and in particular, to ensure that the kinds of methodologies that we sometimes blindly adopt or are using actively are leaving the folks who are already in the margins of the margins out of the equation.
Yeah, and I was going to comment too, Asia, because I think we're just a little ahead on time, behind on time here. Just that we've tried we're doing our best with the data that we have available. So the hope was we'd show that stuff off. So yeah, I was just gonna invite the other part of the group there, Jeremy and who else was here from the group here? Martine, to just show us a little bit about the dashboard, if that's okay, Asia, just because we've got a little behind there. Okay, thank you. Jeremy, just
everyone, sorry. Yep, I couldn't. My Zoom thing disappeared as soon as I shared my screen, so I couldn't unmute myself. Yeah, hi everyone. So my name is Jeremy. I was the project lead. I'll try and be quick here because I realize we're a little bit short on time. I just want to say a big thank you to Refine. He's in the call here. He did pretty much 90% of the work, 99% of the work. I'm just the one presenting it, I suppose. Also, thanks to Ryan for setting up the project, and also to Scott Wells, who also helped a lot in our discussions. And I worked with Christina from SASS. I think she's no longer with there, but shout out to her for helping us with the data. So I'm just going to quickly walk through the dashboard quickly, and I'll kind of share a couple interesting challenges that popped up for those of you that maybe work with Power BI or might be interested. All right, so yeah, as Kerrie and Asia mentioned, this dashboard's located just on their website. And yeah, Refine did an awesome job creating this dashboard. The layout was actually just determined by SASS. They actually used a existing Boston crime dashboard as like a template for what they wanted to create. And so the idea is they just gave us some data, and we wanted to try and basically create a little report that would be useful to them. So there were kind of three main metrics that were in the data: sexual assault reports, the number of charges, and the number of unfounded. I believe unfounded charges, unfounded reports. Okay, and so we just plotted totals here, as well as some percentages and some averages. And in terms of what dimensions we could filter and slice across, we had some yearly information and also community information as well. So yeah, obviously we can go through and cross-filter all of these different visuals and see how the totals change. And also we have this little heat map over there as well, showing just the total number of sexual assault reports across different locations in Saskatchewan. And if you're wondering about what the definition of some of these are, actually on the last page, SASS was nice enough to give us a little glossary of some commonly used terms. So if you're wondering what the definition of a report is, what does it mean for report to be unfounded or founded, or a charge to be laid, the last page has a little glossary that's nice for having the definition of some of these terms used inside of the dashboard. And yeah, there's a couple pages. So this was the main page again, kind of inspired by that Boston crime data set. Okay. And, I'm not going to spend too much time going through everything, but if you want, you can check out the next page, which again breaks down those 3 metrics that we were mainly interested in: sexual assault reports, charges, and unfounded. Okay. And I guess to Kerrie's and Asia's point, notice that we don't have any socioeconomic features or dimension information that we can kind of cross filter across there. I believe this data set came from like some reporting authority, like each police service releases these numbers. So Asia talked about how there might be problems with this data as well. Okay, and we kind of see how these metrics can change over time. Okay, and again, all this is interactive. So if you want to just focus on certain scenarios here, you can click and obviously interact with the dashboard. It's a little bit slow because I'm sharing my screen, but yeah, feel free to play around with this. This is on the SASS website. There's a third page here, again, just showing a bit more detail into the data, kind of slicing by different police services across Saskatchewan. And then additional page at the end here. Okay. So yeah, I don't want to spend too much time on there because you can go in and play around on by yourself, but hopefully it just gives you a brief overview of what the dashboard consists of. Just also want to quickly mention some different kind of challenges or interesting things that might have popped up for those of you that maybe have experience with the analytics or working with Power BI. So the raw data was in kind of a more pivoted format. If you're familiar with Power BI doesn't like that. So it had summarized according to different years. So Refine did a great job of first having to clean and reformat the data into a form that Power BI was happy with. And then we could go ahead and make all the visuals that were needed. That's probably the biggest hurdle. They might have heard like a famous statistic that about 80% or 90% of a data analyst job is just cleaning data and making sure it's formatted correctly. And so that's probably the case in this project as well. There was also just some few typos or errors in the data set that we had to clean up. And another challenge was plotting, geographical data. So with all these small towns and communities, you can imagine that Power BI might not have identified some of them. Especially there was also some places where they were recorded as a rural area. If you notice here, we have like Humboldt and Humboldt Rural. So we have to do a little bit of work there, just making sure that, Humboldt Rural is not a city name, but we just mapped it towards Humboldt. Okay. So a little bit of work there, just making sure that this heat map behaved appropriately. And I think when we just threw in the data originally, we had some what was it, like either Swift Current or like Estevan in like Meetup or something like that. So again, if you graphed locational data in Power BI, you might have stumbled across that problem as well. Okay. And yeah, the colors are obviously really nice. I really enjoy the colors. That was all refined. You think you pulled the color codes from the SASS logo and you can make your dashboard look really nice and pretty. Yeah, I think I'll end it there. Unless Refined has anything else. And hopefully I didn't take up too much time and we can get to the next one.
Now you killed it, Jeremy. That was really good. We got through that really quickly there. I like it. And I really want to thank you, Asia, and thank you, Kerrie, for this. I'll just leave it open to maybe one question if anybody has any questions for Asia or for Kerrie really quickly before we jump into the RPL, the Regina Public Library section.
I see Asia just mentioned in the chat. We're curious how rurality was defined in the model. I think that was from the RCMP. They anything outside of like Estevan, for example, that would be like RCMP as Estevan Rural. Whereas Estevan has their own police service inside of Estevan, so their numbers would have been from the Estevan police services, as far as I know. Yeah.
Such a great point. Thanks, Jeremy. This is something we encounter a lot, just in terms of the lack of standardization of things as most seemingly basic as a definition of rurality between different institutions. So looking into the StatsCan index of remoteness in comparison to how the RCMP are contextualizing it would be very interesting. Thanks so much for that, Jeremy.
Yeah, and Lydia has a question in the chat. I'll just ask her to reply in the chat. I'm going to move on to the next one after that one. We're going to move on to RPL now, because we've got some time for them. This is the last of the projects that we did here that we're going to talk about. So just to set this one up, we do have Alvin Yau, who works, I think he's if Alvin, I'll ask you to come onto the screen here. I don't have a bio for you, but I don't want to say too much about you, but he does work for the Regina Public Library. We've worked with Alvin for the last, about a portion of the year. We had quite a large team, including Martin Chaktura, Sean Milne, Christy Rajan, and a few other folks who kind of had been involved in the project, building out and really helping out the RPL with some of the data needs that they have. So I will first of all, thank Aja and Kerrie again for the really cool information and context that you've been able to provide. And thank you, Jeremy, for showing us the dashboard. But turn it over to Alvin and the team from the Regina Public Library project to talk a little bit more about what they did.
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. Maybe I'll give a couple of lines of self-introduction first. So my name is Alvin Yau. I am the Manager of Planning and Research at Regina Public Library. I'm responsible for data analytics, policies and procedure, among a couple of other things. I was listening to listening about the previous project with great interest because it made me realize that our project, what we worked with Data for Good on, we're in a very different spot. So it provided, I'm so delighted to see things from a different perspective in the previous project. I don't have a PowerPoint, but maybe I will spend a few minutes talking about the impact of our partnership with Data for Good before turning it over to Sean to highlight the real star of the show, which was the dashboard, the tool that they worked with us to create, or we worked with them to create. So to understand first the impact of working with Data for Good, I need to say a couple of things first about why we wanted to work with them. So an important piece of work for us this year is that we're preparing for the Service Points Master Plan that we are working on. So RPL is made up of a downtown central library and 8 branch locations throughout the city. And while many of the 8 branches have undergone relocations and expansions throughout the years, there have been no new branches of RPL. We haven't opened a new branch for about 40 years. And as our city grows, and it is growing really rapidly, as you well know, we must expand our services. We must expand our physical presence and reimagine our offerings to provide our growing city with access to programs and services. So we wanted to take a look at where we are currently offering our services, where we could offer our services in the future, and not just in terms of physical branches, but also perhaps self-service hold lockers and kiosks, for example, partnerships with external stakeholders, physical spaces for programs and services, things of that nature. We don't have any conclusions yet, but this work is critical to help us figure that part of the puzzle out. So we partnered with Data for Good on that to answer these questions, whether there are areas of the city or groups of people who are currently underserved by our current physical layout, whether the current locations or neighborhoods are optimal physical locations for our branches, and what potential locations there are for future service points. The work we did with Data for Good was really collaborative in nature, which I very much appreciated, and our teams communicated regularly to ensure that both teams' needs were being met. In the end, we were able to really leverage the expertise that the Data for Good team had and received some very high quality analysis that answered all of our questions. There were lots of impacts, but I'd like to highlight a couple of short-term impacts and one impact that's a little longer term, more cultural in nature. So the Data for Good team really helped us overcome an expertise issue. So I'm responsible for data analytics, as I mentioned. I have one assessment librarian reporting to me who does a lot of the legwork in terms of data analysis. Neither of us really had an expertise in GIS software, in creating geospatial analysis. So Data for Good really helped us plug that hole on our team. They informed us of data sources that we knew very little about, if at all, and introduced us to a new way to think about geospatial data analysis. I would say, though, that the most important impact of working with Data for Good is much longer term and cultural. And what I mean by that is that since we worked with them, we have acquired GIS software for our own team, and we're starting to learn how to use it to create maps that really tell a compelling story. We've already started work on a project that is unaffiliated with our work with Data for Good, which is already generating a lot of conversations as to where we draw our current clientele from. So I'm quite delighted that the impact of our partnership is long lasting. And with that, I will turn it over to Sean to show you what we did.
Thank you. Martin, do you want to jump in here before I do my before I show some of the slides, or are you okay with me just going ahead?
I think in the essence of time, I think you can take it away. I'll just say Sean and Christy, we are both of them on the call, did the actual heavy lifting on the analysis. So kudos to them. And yeah, Sean, please take it away.
Sounds good. I'm just going to share my screen here real quick. It looks like I don't have, or it doesn't have the capability to share my screen. So Martin, do you have the slides, or do you have the slides available that you can show?
Yes, I do. Just give me 1 second.
Okay, so yeah, so just there's no privileges of my mission to show, but I can just quickly get this started here. So I guess like I'll be doing a lot of talking, but a lot of the great work was done by Martin and Christy. So we worked on this together. We worked in collaboration with the Regina Public Libraries, where a lot of the data did come from them directly. And so I guess one of the things that we looked at, we kind of slice and dice this data in a bunch of different ways. One of the ones that we're kind of most interested in is doing, I guess, what we would call a suitability analysis, where you take a whole bunch of GIS data or a whole bunch of spatial data, and you relate it together. Essentially, you kind of like, you take as much as you can, you essentially overlay it together to create a kind of multivariable analysis. And so we took, this is kind of like this, there's a couple of slides here that show kind of the process of it. And then we'll show kind of one final slide that kind of shows kind of what the resultant product turns out to be. And so one of the things that we were interested in doing, so I guess it's just like going back really quickly. So I work at SASS, and we do this type of thing, the suitability analysis for our own company in terms of, you know, how best to deliver our services. And we did a very similar project about 2 years ago for the Regina Food Bank, which is essentially showing where within the city of Regina, where there are gaps in services of their, of kind of where they're located, or people that had difficulty kind of accessing their services. And so we took very similar approaches, where essentially we took kind of every single variable that we could think of that helped us kind of quantify or see kind of how kind of distributed the city of Regina was. And so I'll just show you a couple of like really interesting slides that came out of it. And so the process that we did was we took the locations of the food bank. So this is, I think it was Regent Place was the library. This is kind of just showing like a dot on the map. And if you go to the next slide, essentially what we did is we took every single address in the city of Regina, then we calculated the travel time from that location to the branch office. And so we did this for mass transit, so buses. We did this for walking, and we did this for essentially driving. Were kind of like the three key kind of things. And so if you go to the next slide, if you continue doing this and you put essentially every single point on the map that shows you that shows you kind of the distance from that person's location to the branch, you can go to the next slide. It creates these what we call like raster images, essentially these fully kind of interpreted maps that show kind of the distribution of travel times. And so if you go to the next slide, if you add in, so that was kind of doing a walking time. So this is doing it in driving time with the actual dots showing kind of the color. The further away someone is from the library, the further, or the points are red, and then the closer they are, the points are yellow. And so it shows you just kind of distribution of travel times within the city. So if you go to the next slide. So if you aggregate all of those for every single library, you get something that looks like this, which shows kind of a distribution map of where things are, where data is, or where customers have good access via transportation, and where the access is sometimes further away or sometimes limited. And so if you go to the next slide, and so we did kind of the same thing around kind of. We took kind of every single variable that we can think of. So we looked at like why people were going to libraries. We were thinking of a lot of times we'd actually, Alvin was really good where they actually ran surveys during our work where they actually asked people that were visiting libraries, what is it actually, why are you actually coming to this library? Like, what is it? Why are you using this library? And so through those results, we gathered a whole bunch of new variables. And one of them was people go to libraries because of amenities that are close to it. And so we plotted locations of shopping locations or kind of retail locations that were somewhat popular for people that were visiting libraries. And so we plotted those on the map. And so if you go to the next slide, we did look at population density, which is just kind of another kind of density-based measurement. So if you go to the next one. So this is kind of like, I have two more slides here, and then I can kind of open it up for questions and hand it over to Ryan. But what we did was we took all of that data, and essentially what you do is you create a scale that's similar across every single dimension. So all the variables have the same scale, and you essentially just stack them on top of them. So this is kind of the best I could do in terms of visualizing what that process looks like, where you essentially just push all the data together, and then you come up with a multivariable analysis of like what that, or where if you combine every single piece of data, where is it most, or I guess best served and least well served within the city. And so if you go to the next slide, so this is essentially kind of like the final output. So all of that work, essentially pulling driving distances, pulling walking distance, pulling mass transit distances, pulling shopping locations, pulling the hierarchy of roads within the city, looking at population density, looking at specific kind of metrics that the public library had provided us as well. You get this one kind of indication, you get this one map that shows, this map showed in green are areas that would be best suited for library kind of locations, whether it's kiosk or branch expansion. And then you have areas that are really well covered. So those ones that be in the red where locations of library would make the most sense. And so essentially this one image takes in literally hundreds of thousands of data points all kind of mashed together into one visualization. And so this is kind of like the end, or I guess this is probably the main product that we delivered to the Regina Public Libraries, but there was a bunch of other analytics as well. And so, but this is probably, it kind of tells the entire data story through one image. And so with that, that's kind of all I have to say today. So.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sean. Really appreciate that, and appreciate everybody getting this in right on time. Again, I want to thank Asia, and I want to thank Kerrie. Maybe I have time for one question. Let's see. Asia, yeah, this is cool. We got some really cool people here doing cool stuff in Data for Good. I think we did have, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Ryan. I was just going to ask if you can describe a little bit more about the suitability of using suitability analyses. So for example,
so yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, Sean, can you just riff off of that for a bit? I'm like really compelled by this.
Yeah, and so it's, I guess there's a whole bunch of ways to do it. Traditionally, how you do it is you create these cell maps of whatever area you're looking at. So every cell represents kind of a data point. And so if you can think, a lot of the time you work in vector data, which is essentially points, lines, and polygons. But when you work in kind of cell-based data, then it gives you the opportunity to like layer on top of each other. And that's really like where GIS or spatial analytics really gets its power, whereas essentially it's not just taking like, here's a map of the roads of Regina, but it's taking a map of the roads of Regina then overlaying like multiple different types of layers on top or near them, and then doing kind of analytics around that, the kind of the relationship at those individual points. And you do that by creating what they call just like raster data, but it's essentially just a cell of the entire area that you're looking at, and then just doing calculations off them. So you can essentially you can imagine just taking, the time that it takes to get from one person's house, and you can create a cell that has that data kind of encapsulated in it. And then you take another one that you layer on top that you can summarize it, average it, subtract it. You can essentially do mathematics based on that. And there's tons of like really kind of advanced methodology around it, but very simply, it's essentially just taking data, interpolating it for the entire region that you're looking at, and then doing just basic mathematics that look at whether it's averaging, summing, totaling, whatever. And then at that point, you can get, I guess, like a complete picture of what you're looking at.
And Asia, I'll jump in and say, hey, if you're really interested in learning more, you should connect with us, and we could talk about what kind of project we could do. Hey, if you're interested, for sure, reach out. Jeremy just had one question. I'll ask you to respond to him in the chat, Sean, just on how time is calculated. If you could just take a look in the chat there. But just because we're running out of time here, I just really wanted to thank everybody for coming out. Alvin, our special guests from RPL, our special guests from Sexual Assault Services Saskatchewan, Kerrie Issac, Asia, we really appreciate your time today. And to all of the folks on the projects, Data for Good Saskatchewan wants to give you a big thank you, because this is amazing work. And I think I saw that there was some really exciting responses from the folks in the chat, because you guys are doing great work. You're making this stuff happen. So if you are looking to get involved with Data for Good, please go to our website. Please sign up as a volunteer. There's a lot of different roles, a lot of different ways to get involved. In addition, I want to point out just a quick plug. The Data for Good Accelerator program is going very well. I wanted to let everybody know that we actually have a community event. Our next event will be actually the demo day for the Data for Good Accelerator program. It's going to be on Thursday, June 27th. I'll be putting more out on the Meetup and on our LinkedIn very, very soon here, as well as sending out some email communication. It's going to be hosted in Regina in person. It's going to be in person in Saskatoon at Great West Brewing, and we're going to do it virtually. We're aiming to get 200 people out. So let's get out there, put it in your calendars. Everybody's invited. It's going to be a good time. So really want to see if we can get a lot of the community out, because it's going to be a lot of fun. So again, thank you, everybody. We really appreciate it. This is how we do this stuff, is through the efforts of all of you folks, all of our volunteers, all of our nonprofits. Just want to say a big thank you. And yeah, if there's anything else coming out of this, please feel free to reach out. Even if you saw something you were interested in, or any one of the project team members, if you want to get in touch with any one of them, reach out to myself. I can be happy to make that connection. Okay, everybody? All righty. Well, have a good one. Thank you, Alvin. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming out. We'll see you on June 27th, right?
Thank you, too. Bye.
Thanks for doing so much hard work there. Bye, everyone.